How to use the hero's journey for story structure so you can write a better novel. Hi, I'm Iris Marsh and I help indie authors publish with confidence. In this video, we'll talk about the hero's journey as a way to outline your novel, and I think this outline works especially well when you're writing an epic fantasy story or sci-fi, but it can also be used for other types of stories. You can use this framework to either outline your story before you start writing, but you can also use it to brainstorm scenes as you're writing and you feel stuck, or to evaluate your story after you've written your first draft. So I will walk you through the 12 different stages of the hero's journey and what they mean. This information comes from the book The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler, which is in the bookcase. If you're interested in the hero's journey, I can highly recommend this book, and I'll put a link to it in the description. So first, here's an overview of the different moments and when they approximately occur within the story. So then you'll have an idea which moments fall within which act. So here you can see that a lot of the moments fall into Act 1, and that the first threshold is kind of the crossing from Act 1 into Act 2. And you can't quite see it here because there's a lot of text, but the ordeal takes place around the midpoint. So the ordeal is more the middle of the story. Then reward is more toward the end. And the road back is also a crossing from Act 2 into Act 3, with then the resurrection as the climax and the return with the elixir as the resolution of the story. So we start with the ordinary world, which is a scene where you describe the ordinary world or the status quo of your protagonist. So this is often the first scene within your book, because that way we know exactly how much things change for the protagonist when the call to adventure, so the next moment, happens. This does not mean that this scene should be mundane or a bit boring, because while it does show the everyday life of the protagonist, there has to be something of interest. So there should be some allude to trouble to come that will intrigue the reader to keep on reading. Then the call to adventure is also known as the inciting incident, and as the name suggests, it's a challenge or an adventure that the protagonist has to undertake. So this incident is either causal, which means that it's caused by a specific action by a character, or it's coincidental, meaning that it's something that just happens on coincidence, like a storm or an earthquake or something that we don't have control over. This call to adventure has to be something that changes the protagonist's life. It has to affect them in some way. The refusal of the call can be a very subtle moment. It can be that the protagonist downright refuses to act based on the call. So they'll just at first say no, but they can also just show some reluctance, so they will go along with it, but you can tell they don't really want to. And some heroes will accept the call instantly, and in this case it's often that they know they don't have any other choice, or they just know that they have to do this, and then you can show that perhaps they feel the adventure could be an improvement of their current circumstances, or that they might still have some reservations in their mind. Or another character can also express doubts that the protagonist can actually answer the call. The meeting with the mentor. The mentor is a very common character in stories. So protagonists often meet them either in the first act or a bit later. It's possible for the protagonist to meet the mentor earlier in the story, but then that might not yet be the moment where they actually become the mentor of the protagonist. So the mentor actually becomes the mentor usually after the call to adventure, not before. Well, they can meet the person before the call to adventure actually happens. So the mentor prepares the protagonist for the unknown, and they will guide and they will teach them until they're ready to face the challenge alone. The crossing the first threshold, this signifies the end of Act 1, and we move into Act 2. In another way, the protagonist crosses from their ordinary world into a new one. And this is where the story truly takes off. In a lot of adventure type of stories, it's often a form of travel from the familiar environment towards new unfamiliar terrain. But the first threshold can also mean something else. So it's really about crossing from the familiar to the unfamiliar. So it can also be something more internal, like the protagonist accepting that magic exists and that they'll become an apprentice, for instance. That will also be crossing the first threshold. So the important thing is that after they cross this threshold, that the protagonist can't go back to their ordinary world. So it has to be in some way irreversible. Tests, allies, and enemies. So this point is more a set of scenes or sequences rather than just one scene. So within the second act, the protagonist will face several tests, and here they will also make allies and enemies. So they begin to learn the rules of the new world, and they'll gain new skills based on the tests, the challenges that they'll overcome. And a test can be an enemy getting in the way, for instance, through sabotage. So the enemies are usually there to form the obstacles. But a test can also be the terrain or the weather or a cursed city or whatever. And while enemies will try and stop the protagonist, allies will aid your protagonist on their journey. So for this moment, you can brainstorm a series of challenges that your protagonist could face and who could be enemies and who could be allies that they'll encounter along the way. The approach to the inmost cave is where we approach the midpoint of the story. So the hero is on the edge of something that's dangerous, and they have to make a plan on how to deal with this dangerous thing. So this might be that they need to find a way to outsmart the villain's guards or a different type of enemy, depending on the type of story you're writing. Then the ordeal, like I said, the ordeal is the midpoint of the story. And this is where the protagonist starts to change because of the ordeal that they face. And there is usually a type of death within this moment. And this can be a physical death, where the protagonist is physically hurt and is close to dying, but it can also be like a professional or internal death. For instance, when the protagonist comes really close to losing everything within their profession they've worked very hard for. So for instance, they might get very close to losing their job or something like that. Or when the protagonist begins to question who they've become. So that's the internal change, when in some stories you'll see the protagonist literally staring into a mirror, questioning who they've become as a person and if this is who they want to continue to be. So with the ordeal, you create a moment that really forces the protagonist to change. The reward. So after the protagonist survives the ordeal, they will receive a type of reward. This can be something physical, like a special weapon, but it can also be internal, like gaining certain knowledge or experience. So whatever they get, it will be something that will help them defeat their antagonist. So it's important to keep that in mind when you come up with a reward. So how can they apply this item or this knowledge in such a way that they can defeat the antagonist by the end of the story? Then with the road back, we cross into Act 3. The road back doesn't literally have to be the road back home. It's possible that the protagonist starts to move back home, but it's more likely that the protagonist will want to go back to the ordinary world, even though they still face the dangers from the antagonist. And this can mean they'll try to find a new sense of normal within the special world that's closer to the ordinary world. So they'll really try to get things back to the way things used to be, even though that's no longer possible. Resurrection. It is the climax of the story. So the protagonist here faces the antagonist to defeat them. And like in the ordeal, there's a type of death depending on the story you're writing, but in the resurrection, the stakes should be much higher than they were in the ordeal. And it's important that the protagonist understands their gifts to defeat the antagonist. What this means is, why is the protagonist the one to be the protagonist in this story, right? Why are they the one to defeat the antagonist? This is usually some type of knowledge or character trait that they have that needs to be grown throughout the story, and then by the end they finally really get what it means, and they can defeat the antagonist that way, or they're training for some type of magic that they have, or whatever else, depending on the story you're writing. And that's something that they have to learn and really hone their skills and understand what it is that they're doing, so that they can defeat the antagonist. And whatever they received as a reward after the ordeal, this is the time that they use it. So after the resurrection, the protagonist is fully reborn. This usually means in a metaphorical way, like in some stories it will be literally, but usually it's metaphorical. So the protagonist doesn't have to actually die and be resurrected. It can mean that after they faced the climax and defeated the antagonist, it changed them in such a way that they can just never go back to the way they were before. They've changed irrevocably. And then finally, the return with the elixir. This is the resolution of the story. And the elixir, like the reward, can be any type of the item. Like it can be something physical, like a type of treasure, but it can also be something internal, like a lesson the protagonist takes back with them. It often also takes shape as takes the form of like love or freedom, wisdom or knowledge. And this is often related to your subplot. For instance, if you have a romance subplot, the elixir is often that they found love, right? They can finally be together with the person that they've loved. They've had this romantic subplot with throughout the story. And that's the final point within the hero's journey framework. And I hope it will help you figure out how to structure your story. If you'd like the hero's journey framework and would like to learn more about it, I've put some helpful links in the description. And if you like a different approach to outlining, you can also get my easy outlining guide, also with a link in the description. And if you enjoyed this video and learned something from it, please hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated for more content. So in the next video, I'm going more in depth into another method for outlining your story, so stay tuned.